Hi, welcome to Pegasus Research Substack Week in Review Unscripted number 11 podcast. I'm Thomas, the founder of and the author for Pegasus Research. I'm an economist, military historian, and a U.S. Army veteran. If you like my content and want to support my work, please consider becoming a subscriber or a follower on Substack or support me on Patreon. The website will be in the description section of this podcast. Okay, so this week was kind of an odd week. We had a holiday here in the U.S., and then I typically post 7 days a week, so there's always an odd week that gets caught up. So this week actually has 4 posts this week. We will talk briefly about I did one on the Memorial Day holiday, meaning of Memorial Day here in the U.S. I'll briefly cover that, but so this week, the articles were German Chancellor Scholz provides perspective without introspection. And then the next one was the history of Memorial Day. And then outgoing NATO Secretary General takes a swipe at the U.S. administration. And the final one is the, last but not least, the West Philippine Sea Newsletter Volume 2. So second week of this newsletter, and these are the topics that we will discuss in today's unscripted podcast. So we'll go back to German Chancellor Scholz provides perspective without introspection. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz wrote a guest essay. He probably didn't write it. He probably had a whole committee helping him. Not saying it wasn't his words, but I'm sure it did not get had to be thoroughly reviewed before it ever got posted on The Economist magazine on May 23rd, 2024. The essay was mainly a discussion about the war in Ukraine, European security, and Germany's commitment to a more secure Europe. He expressed his opinion about Russian President Vladimir Putin and Putin's vision of a new version of an imperialist-style Russia. But outside what the criticism that the chancellor provided on President Putin, his words were both measured and diplomatic and provided insight to his vision of a Europe moving forward. I think this was a chance for Germany to not rebut, but provide some input on the German perspective and what's going on in Europe in response to French President Emmanuel Macron having an article in The Economist as well. One thing the essay lacked candor regarding the erosion of European security due to the Ukraine war, as well as Germany's role in creating the current European crisis or status, security status. The Chancellor did not accept any responsibility for Germany's role in creating the current situation or the challenges required to correct it. Now, in all fairness, Chancellor Scholz was not the Chancellor when most of these decisions were made about German defense policy. These started going all the way back to the reconstruction or the reunification of Germany when the West Germany absorbed East Germany, or the Federal Republic absorbed the German Democratic Republic. So Scholz argues that Germany and its Western allies had to adhere to a few rules that were able to avoid a war in Europe from the end of World War II until the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So his points were, borders are never again to be changed by force. And these are the rules that were used in Europe to prevent a European war, unlike what we've seen in the past. The borders are never going to be changed by force. 2, the sovereignty of all states must be respected. And 3, no country should live in fear of its neighbors again. Seems like a fair assessment, though it seems pretty simplistic. He did state that Putin's imperialist desires, manifested in his invasion of Ukraine, had violated these rules. Now, what Scholz does ignore is that he ignores the Yugoslav wars, the Chechen Civil War, the Russo-Georgian War in 2008, the Ukraine invasion of 2014. So you go back and look at these wars. So obviously this does violate that there have been European wars since World War II. It is true that 3 of the 4 that I outlined above involved Russia. So there is a common denominator there. So Russia's imperialist goals are valid points supporting Chancellor Schultz in his argument. The Yugoslav wars did not involve Russia, and this negates his point that, yeah, a war did happen, and it did not involve Russia, so it did. His points do not hold true. Maybe his belief is, but he didn't really outline it at all, is, okay, the Yugoslav war was maybe considered a civil war. Maybe he considers that outside of the bounds, but we still had an air war against Serbia. NATO. So obviously it's more than just a civil war. So he ignored that part. Probably just didn't want to get bogged down in minutia, but it does negate some of his basic points that he puts in the front end of the article. Now, the Franco-Prussian War, this is going way back into the 1890s, World War I, World War II, which spanned borders have not seen since World War II. So this generally confirms his correctness. So this is kind of an argument back to the Yugoslav war, is that it stayed within the containment of the old Yugoslavia. It did not spread into countries that existed at the same time that Yugoslavia did when it split up into many different countries. Excuse me, I don't know how many different countries that the Yugoslavia broke into. So maybe if you sit there and say, well, okay, the Yugoslav war is a civil war, and it didn't cross borders like the previous wars prior to World War II. But there's still wars that did cross borders that, again, involved Russia. So it seemed kind of strange that he would make those points on things that were so easily negated. And so maybe my point of view is, maybe I'm too literal, is why would you put something that can be not true? Sometimes you just got to put something out there. Maybe it was more aspirational, but he didn't put that in the article. So kind of quibbling on the points, but if up front your article is that far off, it does seem to make does some head scratching. So the Ukraine war can also be argued that it's not any different than the post-World War II wars listed above. Apart from the length, scale, and Western reaction, so the difference in the current Ukraine war lies in the response from the West, which was experienced a mini Neville Chamberlain moment that occurred in September 1st, 1939, at the start of World War II, when it became clear to the world that appeasement only made the aggressor bolder. So despite Russia's aggressive acts in the 2000s, and I listed them above, the Chechen Civil War, the Russo-Georgian War, and the Ukraine invasion in 2014, the West was just, again, many Chamberlain moments. They buried their head into the ground, ignored the what was emerging in Europe from Russian aggression. One can argue that Russia's boldness stemmed from the German government's post-Cold War ostrich-like behavior over its reliance on soft power. They certainly were not threatening Russian retaliation over the various invasions all the way up to the 2014 Ukraine invasion, which we'll cover later, did force NATO to finally adopt a 2% GDP target for defense spending, which we'll find out that Germany did not even pay attention to something that he had agreed to. So now I will say that there are, I've read some articles from a NATO officer in Europe, and he does make some point that sometimes the 2% on defense budgets can be buried into other factors of a budget. Like, for example, maybe if you use a certain amount of the railroads are used to for military purposes and are dedicated to military purposes, but the budget shows in maybe their transportation budget, and on their military budget, that could be something that where you could find some spending that doesn't show up in defense spending. But having said that, it's a valid point. Yes, because there's a way that everybody can play with their budgets. The U.S. even does it with the opposite. We actually show we probably show less in spending on defense than we truly do when you can count the VA budget, the Veteran Affairs budget. So that valid point that there could be some hiding of, not hiding, but other defense-related spending that's in other parts of the budgets outside of the straight defense budget. But that's not the case in Germany for the most part. So following the Cold War, Germany faced the cost of merging with the German Democratic Republic, East Germany. That was an expensive proposition, but it was also an aspirational goal of the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, to bring back one Germany again. So with the end of the Cold War, and under this new pressure, the cost of merging with East Germany, Germany swiftly lowered their defense budgets due to the absence of the Soviet threat. And that was called the peace dividend. And this helped finance the union between Germany, or between West Germany and East Germany. On top of other Western nations also did drop their defense budgets, reduce their military sizes. That wasn't just Germany that did that. To give you an example, at the end of the Cold War, the Bundeswehr had 500,000 armed members of their armed forces and 170,000 civilian personnel. It rapidly reduced itself and today stands at 180,000 members and 80,000 civilian personnel. So it's less than half the size of what it was in the past, almost a third of the size. While it's true that the Cold War numbers were no longer necessary, it's just, you didn't need that many troops in Central Europe and Western Europe anymore, especially without a Soviet-Russian threat. But the execution and reductions of the Bundeswehr was extraordinarily reckless about the way they did it. Not only did they reduce the number of personnel, but they also starved the military of equipment and spare parts, which caused combat readiness to fall well short of what you would expect from a military that had 180,000 members in it, or what you would expect from a country with an economy and a population the size of Germany. The German military was absolutely just over decades was absolutely decimated as a fighting force. They'd been better off reducing below 180,000 and make it at least a credible armed force. But again, I don't want to say this is my personal opinion. Obviously, I've read the readiness numbers of Germany, and it's a pretty sad proposition right now. So Germany adopted an approach that relied on NATO, particularly the United States, to provide its security, which ultimately led to a negative impact on European deterrence. So what I mean by that is that Germany, by reducing its armed forces in Central Europe to such a point, it was no longer really considered a credible deterrent factor for, let's say, Russian imperialism. If you believe in the fact that there is Russian imperialism, and I think there's a strong case to be said about that, through just the 3 wars outside of Ukraine, or the current Ukraine war. So there is something to be said about the idea of Russian imperialism. But you think the Russians ever thought, well, we can't do this because what will the Germans do? No, that wasn't even in the mind of the Russian leadership, and probably wasn't on the mind of anybody else in NATO, as they had to pick up the slack of the biggest economy in the European Union, in Europe, and not being a force at all to be considered any type of deterrence. So, though Chancellor Scholz doesn't admit the above about the decimation of German forces, he talks about, and he boasts the point that Germany will permanently deploy 1 full brigade to Lithuania, I think in 2025, for its defense against a potential Russian threat to the Baltics. This is legitimate. These countries Russia talks about its paranoia of the West and being invaded by the West twice in the 20th century. Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia probably have they do have a credible concern or valid concern that is just as legitimate as Russia's concern about being invaded by the West. Those Baltic countries are afraid of being invaded by Russia. So there is a valid point to that, and these are small countries, and they would need some type of support from NATO. So Germany has agreed for the first time. It has provided a armed force outside of its borders to another NATO country. Now, they did actually deploy troops to Afghanistan, but they did not hold a combat role necessarily. But this is just something different where they're actually permanently deploying. The Afghanistan was a rotational, there was not a permanent deployment. This is a permanent deployment of a German brigade in Lithuania, paid for by the German and Lithuanian governments. Schultz also stated that Germany will provide one division with a higher readiness status to contribute to NATO. This is assumed he means outside of the one brigade that they're sending to Lithuania, which probably is coming out of the normal German armed forces formation. They're not adding a new brigade to just do this. They're probably taking a brigade out of one of the current divisions in the force structure of the Bundeswehr. Now, they talk about providing one division plus this brigade that are going to have a higher readiness factor. The German army is assigned 7 divisions. That's their formation, to provide 7 divisions for their force structure and that are to contribute to NATO. So all of a sudden, one division and one brigade doesn't look like a lot of force. Especially, again, we're talking about the biggest economy in Europe. Now, it's not necessarily Chancellor Scholz's fault because a lot of these decisions were made well before he was ever thinking about becoming chancellor. So just decades of poor management of the Bundeswehr and not keeping up with spending. We'll talk about that here coming up. So Germany, yes, dollar-wise, they're the biggest economy. They have not provided a significant contribution to European or NATO deterrence against a recognized Russian threat. Again, their force it's been so difficult because of their force structure and their readiness factors and their equipment that they could deploy outside their borders. Again, so Germany was not even in the mind of Russia as they consider invading Ukraine in 2014 and 2022. So, and this goes into some of the factors that go in there, is that even when the Russians invaded Ukraine in 2014, which that seized the Crimea and parts of the Donbass, Germany and its NATO partners agreed that all members would contribute 2% or more of their GDP to defense spending. Despite this, Germany agreed to this, but despite this, they'd never increased their defense spending to the agreed target. NATO agreements or Russian threats, Russian invading Ukraine. This was not enough to push Germany to improve its readiness. So, again, it just goes into the factor that despite what Chancellor Scholz is saying, again, he wasn't responsible for this decades of ignoring the German armed forces. Chancellor Scholz should be credited with trying to improve Germany's position within NATO and Europe, but it took another invasion of Ukraine to do that. So when I say that is that Scholz was the chancellor for 3 months prior to the invasion of Ukraine. He didn't do anything. He did not change anything. In fact, they were headlong to go into Nord Stream 2. So they were not considered, he didn't come in on theory that they were going to improve defense spending and German combat readiness. None of that. None of that was being discussed. So but to his credit, that after the invasion, it finally jump-started Germany that, hey, something has to be done. They finally committed to a 2% GDP goal and created a special fund of 100 billion euros to jumpstart procurement to improve readiness and effectiveness of the Bundeswehr. This $100 billion is supposed to be over and above the current GDP targets. Now, the Federal Minister of Defense of Germany, Boris Pistorius, has stated that Germany has reached its 2% target and foresees the need for GDP spending to increase as high as 3.5% before the end of the 2020s. To put this in context, prior to the war in Ukraine, Germany's defense spending was only 1.3% of GDP. So again, they've been starving their armed forces for decades. So again, even when they agreed to a 2% target in 2014, that still did not change the math for Germany increasing their defense budget. Excuse me. So despite this, numerous obstacles, this $100 billion fund and this commitment to go to 3.5% or up to 3.5%, which is likely true. I think that the Defense Minister Pistorius has a valid point. I think his numbers and just my, we'll say, semi-amateur view is probably the right number, 3.5%. So it still takes some time to get the armed forces up, but I think that's a number that is what is needed for Germany to take its place in the central part of Europe. Excuse me. But also remember, they got catch up to do. So that 3.5% also has to help them catch up from those decades of needing new equipment and so on and so forth. So they have some catching up to do. So they do have to go well above the 2% to get themselves to a point that they're can get something above a one division combat ready. So despite this this $100 billion funds, there's a lot of obstacles that go in the way of improving these as I call them, the long neglected German armed forces. Now, the $100 billion Euro special fund has been criticized as being too slow to be used to help improve the situation. Yeah, I mean, everybody wants to move forward faster, but this is government. The U.S. government is not any better. They can come up with a big budget number, but it takes years to find a way to find appropriations. It's not like everybody can just go in there and start building defense products immediately. This takes some time to build up. So that's probably a little bit of an unfair criticism of the German government currently. Now, Germany initially opted out. So we're going to talk about their spending, how they're trying to use that $100 billion. Germany initially opted out of the F-35 Lightning project, F-35 Lightning II fighter program. They opted out. But now they've used 30 billion euros of that $100 billion euro fund to purchase 35 new stealth aircraft, as well as the support structures needed for the aircraft. And also there's some U.S.-made heavy lift helicopters involved in that $30 billion. So it's not like they're paying $1 billion or nearly $1 billion per aircraft. There's other things that have to go in with it. There's training involved. There's the maintenance requirements. So there's a lot of things that Germany has spare parts. They have to purchase a lot of these items to be able to support those 35 stealth fighters that they're buying. Now, it takes time to produce these new aircraft, and because Germany was late into the program, they are not expected to get their first delivery of new fighters until 2029. I think I read that the numbers is that their German pilots would go to the United States for training sometime in 2028 to be ready to fly those first delivery in 2029. Now, Germany has been spending the remaining funds, the 70 billion left over, more slowly in response to critics that want it to focus more on domestic defense manufacturing. So they don't want to just rely on the United States to provide all this defense spending. So they are going to switch over, try to find something to buy more in Europe. And Germany still produces, even though they don't procure a lot, they still make advanced weapon systems, probably some of the best in the world. So they do have the ability to spend at home. It's just a matter of how much production capacity does the state have. Certainly, they're going to have to it will take some time to expand into it. Now, the unusual thing about this is the way they've structured the loan, or this $100 billion. It's basically a loan. So they have to pay 8% interest. Germany has to pay 8% interest on this $100 billion. They also have, just similar to the U.S., they have higher than normal inflation. There's primarily due to inflationary pressure of energy prices. So that's eroding the value of the fund. Also, when Germany starts procuring defense needs from domestic sources, it will also have to pay a value-added tax, VAT, of 19%. So that erodes further into the fund. So unlike the U.S., because the U.S. doesn't have a value-added tax, So, and the government is tax exempt. So, there's nothing like that that erosive spending in the U.S. Now, you say, well, why can't Germany government be exempt? Well, they would be sticking the manufacturers that continue to upgrade the value of a raw good all the way to something that can be used for production. These companies have already paid that. So if you say, okay, we're not going to pay the 19% VAT, you are sticking the company that's just doing your final manufactured good, which they had to buy goods from their sourcing, which also had a 19% value-added tax if it was domestically sourced. So you would be just sticking those companies. The German government would be sticking those companies with a 19% loss that they would probably just turn around and just do an increase to stay profitable. So in the end, because the tax structure in Germany is because the way they like to have that value, or they prefer that value-added tax, I'm not going to criticize one way or another. That's just the way the government helps fund itself, is that 19% has to be paid on those domestic spending. So they're going to spend 70 billion euros in Germany. They are going to have to pay that 19% tax. So they're going to get 19% less bang for the buck of that 100 billion euros plus the 8% interest. So putting all these factors in, it's expected to reduce the fund in real terms. Again, inflation, interest, VAT it's expected to reduce that 100 billion to 50 to 60 billion. And remember, 30 billion is already spent in the US. So that's already spent. So you're talking about a significant reduction where you're probably looking at only 30 billion euros left to be available to spend in real terms on defense products. So all of a sudden that 100 billion in real terms turns out to be 60 billion, of which 30% is already spent. So based on these estimates, well over 2/3 have already been spent or earmarked to be spent. So it is moving along as you would expect a government program to do, and having to ramp up defense spending in a manufacturing base that has to start tooling up for providing more defense goods to the government. However, it will take time for the situation in the Bundeswehr to improve. So the other part is Germany has donated 30 billion euros of defense equipment to Ukraine to help it fight the Russian invasion. This is 18% of the German defense budget since the start of the Ukraine war. So while you can argue that arming Ukraine contributes to defense spending or to European defense, it does hinders the Bundeswehr's ability to enhance its combat readiness by transferring equipment. Now, some of it was probably old, probably needed to be replaced, which will be part of that $100 billion fund, but it just puts Germany further in the hole, trying to because what it's trying to do is it's not only trying to rearm itself, it is trying to also help arm Ukraine. It's a lot to do in a force that has been badly neglected over the decades. So the other issue that he didn't address in his article was Germany's dedication to green energy and its response to the Fukushima nuclear accident in 2011, which made the German policy in 2011 that it would start retiring its nuclear reactors, and it has retired 14 of its 17 reactors since the Fukushima accidents. So Germany has not reduced its energy needs, and its population has increased. Germany still has energy needs that can't be fulfilled by the green initiatives, and it cannot make up for the nuclear power that is being lost. So what they've been pursuing, first started with former Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, becoming the chairman of what's called the Shareholder Committee for Nord Stream 1 gas pipeline that was bringing gas from Russia to Germany. And at this point, it was bringing 55% of Germany's gas was being provided by Russia. So what happened is Germany shuts down gas pipelines, it's shutting down its coal plants, it's going to green energy, and what it's doing is it's outsourcing its energy needs to Russia. So Russia just brings in gas through the pipelines. So Germany's creating the impression of being environmentally conscious more so than it actually is. The way I say this is because Russia is less environmentally responsible than Germany. So the German decision has actually probably contributed to a negative environmental impact. And again, I argue this is because I can about guarantee that the Germans are more environmentally conscious in if they domestically provided energy versus what the Russians are doing in drilling for gas and then pipelining it to Germany. So the overall point is that Germany was not only spending money to purchase Russian energy, but it was also ready to expand it through the now defunct Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which became defunct after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So you go in there, Germany's lack of military deterrence, it was also actively funding Russia and enabling it to pursue its imperialist goals. So Germany continued this all the way past the 2014 invasion. So not only were they not spending 2% on the German armed forces, they were also buying more and more energy from Russia. And so what's happening is they're not a deterrent, which is negative, so Germany is not considering the factor of the Russians saying, well, we can't invade blah, 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 because the Germans we're afraid of the German reaction. Well, the German military reaction wasn't there. They had no significant hard power deterrence towards Russia. But they were also, on the other side, they were helping fund the Russian war machine by purchasing so much gas. Now, they weren't the only buyers of gas, but they were buying a large portion of gas, so you can argue that they were helping support the Russians' imperialist goals. Not intentional, but they were also burying their heads like, okay, well, this isn't happening. So the Chancellor, and again, I'll go back into this, is a lot of these problems that Germany was facing is not Chancellor Scholz's fault. He was not an elected leader in Germany when these pre-Ukraine war decisions were made. But he was elected 3 months prior to the war in Ukraine, and he was not thinking about any of this defense spending. He was full on board with bringing Nord Stream 2 pipeline on board to bring more Russian gas into Germany and become more dependent on Russia. So he was not a proponent for energy independence of Germany, or at least reducing Germany's dependence on Russian energy, nor did he promote increasing defense spending. And none of this happened, or none of this changed until after the Russian invasion. So it was a good article, I thought. It was he made some good points countering what, not necessarily disagreeing with the French. He just provided the German view of European security. But I think he didn't take any real introspection of how Germany got to this point where they are today. So next article was the history of Memorial Day. I'll just kind of go over this one really quickly. Memorial Day was, I didn't realize this, I thought it was been around longer than that. It did not actually become a federal holiday until 1971, when something called the Uniform Monday Holiday Act, the congressional name, became law, making Memorial Day nationwide be observed on the last Monday of May. Prior to this, most states recognized May 30th as Memorial Day, and it was usually state holidays. But it wasn't always the case, because the first observances of what they called Decoration Day, that was the original what they called Memorial Day, was immediately after the end of the U.S. Civil War. And it was observed in different ways in both North and South, with observances in the spring, sometime in the spring, paying tribute by decorating the graves of the war dead. That's why it was called Decoration Day. Now, the U.S. government recognized Waterloo, New York, in 1966 as the birthplace of the formal observance of Decoration Day in 1866. Now, it kind of ignores some of the Southern roots, is that it wasn't all just a Southern holiday, but there were some Southern observances prior to even the end of the Civil War. Interestingly enough, it was read some parts about Also, there was in South Carolina, which was the first state to secede from the Union in the U.S. Civil War. It also was one of the first observances of freed slaves celebrating Union dead in the graves, their grave sites in South Carolina. Kind of an interesting side point. So in 1868, the first real organization towards Decorations Day happened when Major General James Logan stated in May 30th, 1868, that this was a day of strewing flowers or otherwise decorating the graves of comrades who died in the defense of their country. And so that's how it became Decoration Day. The general chose May 30th because there's no notable battles fought on that day during the Civil War. Now, the South saw it different. They were still hurting, brooding over the loss of in the war, and they just thought it was another attempt to celebrate Union dead and not Confederate dead. So they largely did not participate in the May 30th observances. But they did have their own observances. They just did not recognize it as May 30th, and they did not recognize it as Decoration Day. So after 1868, most U.S. states passed a form of Decoration Day on May 30th. It did not change until after World War I, when the holiday was transitioned from honoring the dead of the Civil War to honoring all those who died in all the wars and conflicts of the United States. And again, it later became Memorial Day. So it is also considered the most solemn holiday on the federal calendar, which sometimes gets lost because usually the Memorial Day holiday is viewed as the start of summer and tends to be a point of celebration, and oftentimes the Memorial Day holiday and what it was meant to commemorate is often lost in the celebrations of the start of summer. Many try to make sure that people remember why they have a 3-day weekend. Again, I'm a veteran too, so I do bring that up as well. Not to sit there and ruin anybody's fun, but hey, just remember what the original holiday is about. Just take time and before you start your barbecues, think about why this holiday occurred. So 1.2 million service members have died in the service of their country. So, for example, American Civil War, the bloodiest war in U.S. history, 620,000 people or soldiers killed. That's both North and South. World War II, 405,000. World War I, 117,000. Vietnam War, 58,000. The Korean War, 37,000. The American Revolutionary War, about 25,000. The War of 1812, about 20,000. The Mexican-American War, about 13,000. The current War on Terror, 7,000. Spanish-American War, 2,000. And the Gulf War, 258. So I was in during that time period, so I often call it the swan song of the Cold War U.S. Army and or military. So just to add on there is that this is a day to remember and honor all who died in the service of the United States, for we are ever in their debt, and it deserves our eternal gratitude. So they're not going to spend much on that, just an interesting trivia on the Memorial Day holiday in the United States. So next article is outgoing NATO Secretary General takes a swipe at the U.S. administration. So outgoing NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg takes a swipe at the U.S., dragging out a decision to allow Ukraine to use donated weapons to attack targets in Russia. I will say that there has been some big changes in that, and I will be writing about that this week, to be released early next week, about some of the changes that Stoltenberg was arguing for. So more to come next week on that. So French President Emmanuel Macron has been the highest profile leader calling for the allowing of U.S. and Western donated weapons to Ukraine to be allowed to attack targets in Russia. So President Macron has been the biggest supporter of it. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, the UK Foreign Secretary David Cameron, and now outgoing NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg are some of the biggest proponents of changing policy to allow the use of Western weapons against Russian targets. That's typically, it's strange that the NATO Secretary General would be so vocally opposed to the largest member of NATO, the biggest contributing member of NATO as far as a single country, that he would be so publicly opposed or to U.S. policy. Also, the U.S. is the biggest provider of weapons to Ukraine. I think the European Union does provide more financial aid, but most of the weapons aid, or still the U.S. is still the biggest contributor to weapons aid, with the European countries following fairly close behind as well. So that's kind of unusual, but I think it's because he's at the end of his term, so he's probably a little bit freer to speak. Now, the U.S. is kind of split on this as far as using weapons to attack Russia. President Biden and his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, are concerned that allowing the use of U.S. and Western weapons against targets risks an escalating war. Russia has stated that attacks on Russia by Western weapons would serve as justification for the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine and against countries that supplied those weapons. This threat, along with several nuclear drills held by Russia, has caused the White House to take a cautious approach. Consequently, the U.S. has imposed stipulations on the conduct of the war. So that, now, I talked about 2 weeks ago about China has tried to play a moderating influence on trying to reduce the amount of nuclear threats that Russia has used. And so we have seen somewhat of a reduction in those threats, but there were nuclear drills held by Russia just about 3 or 4 weeks ago. That was clearly directed towards Europe. So the nuclear threat hasn't completely gone away, or the threats by Russia of nuclear war have not gone away. So what's becoming clear is that Stoltenberg is becoming impatient with the U.S. administration's cautious approach and the apparent micromanagement of the war. And why we say this is because you find that the Biden administration comes up with these firm lines, and then they eventually cave in once pressure gets applied to them. So ATACMS, long-range MLRS systems, multiple launch rocket systems. At first, ATACMS weren't going to be because the range could reach targets in Russia. So they weren't allowed. But eventually they were. M1 battle tanks. Not going to get M1 battle tanks. Eventually it was allowed. Not going to get F-16s. Eventually allowed. So eventually anything that he's agreed to, after he gets pressured, they go ahead and relent to the pressure. So this has been a source of frustration expressed by European leaders. And they do have a friendly ear in the U.S. government through Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. So they're on the other side of the Biden-Sullivan axis, who want to contain and manage the war. The problem is that the Biden-Sullivan approach is they clearly, right outlines, they put restrictions and they communicate them to the Russians. So the Russians know exactly the restrictions and they adjust their military strategy accordingly by establishing safe havens within the Russian borders, because the U.S. says they are not allowed to attack targets in Russia. If you take donated Western weapons, you cannot use those weapons. And this does not even apply to U.S. weapons. This applies to all weapons. So the Biden administration's position is no weapons that are donated by the West are to be allowed to attack Russia. So the administration's basically doing an employment of a micromanagement style of warfare which is the exact same approach that President Lyndon Johnson administration did in handling the Vietnam War from the White House. Remember, the White House would famously come up with targets that were to be attacked in Vietnam and not leaving it up to the field and theater commanders. They had to say so, but final approvals had to come from the White House. So they also had safe havens because they didn't want to widen the war. So the Viet Cong, which were the South Vietnamese guerrillas, and the North Vietnam, NVA, had safe havens in Cambodia and Laos. And this allowed the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong forces to conduct operations in South Vietnam from these safe havens. They used the Ho Chi Minh Trail that traveled through those areas. And for the most part, these weren't allowed to be attacked. And certainly locations in Cambodia were not allowed to be attacked under the Johnson administration. So the current administration has taken this type of approach that was used in Vietnam. And you could argue that it was failed in Vietnam, at least during the Johnson administration. So Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin are generally in disagreement with the Biden-Sullivan approach. I say this is because Austin is a product of the post-Vietnam U.S. military, and because he came up shortly after the rebuilding of the U.S. military after the Vietnam War, he has a disposition not to allow the mistakes of the Vietnam War to happen again. And he's at the point that once political decisions are made, the military decides how best to accomplish the goal. Secretary Blinken comes to the same conclusion, but from a different direction. Blinken, as I said, is no Henry Kissinger, who was President Nixon's national security advisor and later Secretary of State. And Secretary Blinken is willing to defer to the European position, so to create a consensus with the United States, instead of providing clear U.S. leadership. So the two most powerful cabinet members they're not in a public rebellion, but they're not hiding that they're in disagreement with the administration. So it sets up a weird dynamic where they're not in agreement with the White House and they're not hiding their position either. So the split is not behind closed doors, so the world knows this, including the Russians. So Secretary General Stoltenberg, again, he also disagrees with the president and aligns himself with the Blinken-Austin faction. And he also understands that international pressure can manipulate U.S. policy, and that can be destabilizing because the Russians don't know where even these firm rules come from, that they're always subject to change. So this is kind of a difficult concept so I hope I can explain this correctly, or something that makes sense. So the destabilizing aspect is the lack of leadership in a Vietnam-style war policy that, when under sufficient pressure, the president will concede and allow donations of weapon systems that were once completely off guard or off limits. So all inflexible positions or all firm red lines are ultimately flexible when pressure is applied, allowing them to concede on weapon systems that were previously restricted to Ukraine, but now have been sent over on differing timelines. What I mean is, first ATACMS could go, then M1s could go, and then F-16s will go. So like three different arguments concurred, and eventually it wasn't like, okay, well, we're going to allow lifting of all weapons that can be donated to Ukraine. It was every one of them had to be argued by either within the differing elements within the administration or from its international allies. The destabilizing factor is that the administration, rather than adopting a position of strategic ambiguity that would keep the Russians guessing what the U.S. and allies will do, has publicly stated clearly defined limits. But these clearly defined limits aren't clearly defined because, again, the attempt to an appropriate amount of pressure will cause the administration to relent and allow previously restricted weapons to be sold. So But once he agrees to it, then the administration still attempts to micromanage the war from the White House. So he relents, but he's not changing the overall policy of how they try to manage the war. So again, this says that no matter what policy is, it is, or how strongly the red line is, it says, okay, it's all susceptible to change. So if you have strategic ambiguity, the Russians are uncertain what U.S. actions are, and thereby there's a necessity and degree of self-discipline because the Russians don't know what the real boundaries are. So instead of pushing it because there's no stated policy, the White House goes in there and says they articulate the rules. No, these will not be sold. You cannot attack Russia. But now they can go in there and change those policies if public pressure intensifies. So I wrote it, said this seems like a distinction without a difference, but the subtleties is what makes the two an important difference. Strategic ambiguity leaves one party uncertain about the boundaries and can be difficult to counter without resorting to escalation or threats. So it's hard to sit there and say what I should do as a policy when I don't know what the policy is on the other side. And that's the idea, is it becomes a self-restraining policy, especially when we talk about the world of nuclear weapons. So strategic ambiguity gives some form of pause because you don't know what the limits are. You don't know what the policy is, and you don't know what your enemy's going to do. You have educated guesses, but you don't really know. The difference is that using a threat like threats that counteract red lines are subject to change without notice by issuing counter-red. So go in there and say, okay, you cannot. We won't allow weapons to attack Russia. And that's a public red line, but they're subject to change without notice. So what the Russians would need to do to say, okay, if your policy right now is that you will not allow weapons to attack us, if you change that policy, we are going to attack you, or we're going to do X policy. We're going to go through nuclear drills, or this is all hypothetical, so these are not true. We're going to explode a nuclear bomb within the borders of Ukraine. So that's the case where you know what the red line is. So they sit there and say, okay, we're not going to allow weapons to attack Russia. But then pressure starts getting applied, and they say, oh, okay, maybe. But since you already know what the red line is, they're saying, okay, no weapons will attack. So what you do is you want to keep that position in place. You act a counter threat to say, if you lift that policy, we will consider that a freedom to use nuclear weapons. Again, hypothetical. So the idea is that if you sit there and say what the red line is, that you won't do it. And if you think about changing it, the way to keep them locked in place is to issue a counter threat to try to keep the policy from changing. The problem is, if the policy changes, what do you do next? And apparently that's the steps we're going to be we might have crossed into. Not saying nuclear weapons. That was just theoretical, just to show the differences. So there will be a lot of things coming up if they do allow, which it looks like it's going to happen. They're going to allow Western weapons to attack Russian targets. So again, more coming next week on that topic as it starts rolling out. So it's still a fluid situation. So the reason also is, okay, the White House did say, okay, you can't, again, this week's policy is you cannot use Western weapons to attack Russian targets. But Ukraine is allowed to use their domestically produced weapons to attack Russia, and that does not have any consequences to Western aid to Ukraine. But the administration has asked them not to attack targets that are for Russian energy trade. So don't attack targets that provide oil and gas to the global market because they do not want to cause a price shock or a supply shock in the world oil market or energy markets. So again, even though there's sanctions on Russian oil, they still, meaning the West, the U.S. still wants Russian oil on the market. So the intent is not to eliminate Russian oil because that what the shock is. So they're telling the Ukrainians, yes, you can attack Russia using your own domestically provided weapons, but don't provide oil and gas because that's not what the U.S. or West wants, and that might cause loss of domestic support for the war, the continued funding of the war. So the other part that I'll go into is what becomes frustrated, and I talked about this, is that the varying timelines, and this frustrates the Europeans and Stoltenberg, is, okay, ATACMS are off limits. So the Europeans argue that this, and the Ukrainians argue, hey, we need to have these, blah, blah, blah. U.S. relents. We need, so you think, okay, we've already argued the logical reason why these types of weapons should be allowed. But then they come up and say, well, how are we going to do M1s? Now the whole thing goes over. They have to re-argue the same point. They have to relitigate something that they've already litigated with the administration. It's not an official court hearing, so I just say, but they have to argue the same point that they already argued that the government, the Biden administration, already accepted as being a logical argument. So then the Europeans have to come back and re-argue that point. The exact same point they made before by just inserting the change in the name of the weapon system. Replace ATACMS with cluster bombs, replace cluster bombs with M1s, replace M1s with F-16s. They're having to make the same logical arguments over and over again to the administration. And this comes into the idea of trying to manage the war from the White House. So that has been something that's been a frustration, and something I understand. I'm not saying I necessarily disagree with the Europeans' frustration. I also say that I don't necessarily disagree with some of the aspects of what the administration's doing. Everybody knows my position. I think that we need to find a negotiated end to this war. That's my general position, but I also kind of understand what the White House approach is from one aspect, and the idea is that they can't just let every single weapon system in the U.S. be available to the Ukraine and allow them to use them however they want. So I kind of understand that, but I definitely understand the fact that the Europeans argue a point with logic, and then that logic is accepted. But then they have to re-argue the same logic, and that turns around and gets accepted. Then they turn around to argue the same logic that gets accepted. So I know it gets a little tiresome and frustrating to the Europeans, especially as they view their security is at risk, as the U.S. is viewed as being slow to provide weapons. There's a bigger factor about Europeans supplying weapons as well, but we won't get into that in that argument, this paper. So the other part is that Stoltenberg is trying to work with European allies to provide a $100 billion Euro fund that is immune to the political whims of European Union or the United States as far as elections go. So this would enable the Ukrainians to depend on aid for their war effort unaffected by the results of elections, both in Europe and the United States. I know they always say, well, if Trump becomes elected, that he'll end the war, he'll stop supporting Ukraine. I'm not going to get into that argument because I think that's an overly simplified argument, and it's actually a dumb argument. But I get it. I get the feeling is that, okay, I understand their position on that one based on what Trump has said, but I don't think they're fully appreciating what the fullness of the U.S. is just not going to pull out support of Ukraine. But the Europeans have their own issues too. They have they've had elections in some of the Eastern European countries, and there's been skepticism coming from the East about the continued support of the war, where other Eastern countries are very wholehearted. So yes, elections on both sides do impact the European support for the war. So the $100 billion fund is supposed to be created to be immune to the impacts of elections. It would eliminate this $100 billion fund would eliminate the U.S. administration's micromanagement of the war effort, provided they agree to remove all restrictions on the use of donated weapons and the types of weapons that can be donated. I think that's kind of a slippery slope, and I think that probably there is some legitimate, there is a legitimate argument to be made about restrictions on types of weapons. And at some point, there's got to be an actual red line. We can't go around providing F-35 fighters to be sold to a country that still hasn't even been trained up in F-16s. So I think that's a little bit of fantasy. I think Stoltenberg would say that he's not saying the types of weapons, but if you want to remove the micromanagement of the U.S. administration, the idea is you have to be able to free up whatever weapons you want from the U.S. arsenal, they can be provided to Ukraine. Don't think that's going to happen. I don't think has stated that specifically, but that's the logic of the argument. So, or the logical conclusion of Stoltenberg's argument. So what's unusual too is that the Secretary General of NATO is so publicly opposed to how the U.S. is managing the war, because it's the most powerful member state and provided the most military equipment. Now, I could sit there and say that he's trying to leverage the byproduct of a administration that's divided. You have the Biden-Sullivan faction, and you have the Blinken, Lloyd Austin faction. Also, because they've proven that political pressure, when applied correctly, ultimately the president will give in to the European demands and the Ukrainian demands. Making these exceptions create diplomatic confusion and greater instability. As talked about, Russia is the way to stop these firm red lines from ever changing is to issue counter threats, and you need to follow through with them. Hopefully, it never gets to that point, but we will see. Apparently, we will be seeing. So, the other thing is, does Stoltenberg really have the authority to do this? Budgetary decisions and decisions of how to use military force ultimately fall on the member states, not on NATO leadership. So NATO provides a lot of, obviously they're the alliance and the military arm that fights war, but they have no statutory authority. They do not control budgets. They receive a budget from the Europeans. They receive military forces from member countries. Ultimately, they do not have the say so. Now, I would say that NATO is a well-run alliance, probably the most well-run alliance in history, at least on paper. Fortunately, it's never had to fight a war on Europe as a combined force. So the question comes up is, does he really have the authority to do this? Because this $100 billion fund, this falls on member states, not on NATO. So, more to come on that one. Again, as I said, when I wrote this article, there was some meetings, and apparently that it looks like there's the move to restrict the use of weapons, Western weapons, donated weapons attacking Russia, might be at an end. We'll see if there's any stipulations on those, but it does look like there will be some changes in policies, and so we'll see how that goes. More to come on this issue. So finally, the West Philippine Sea Newsletter Volume 2. Volume 1 did not do particularly well to start with, but then after I posted the Unscripted number 10 podcast, it did pick up in popularity. So we will see if this is something that there's an actual demand for. I think it's, again, a very important topic. The Philippines does play a fairly close linchpin of what goes on in policy inside the South China Sea issues. I still think that the Philippines holds a strong position against China because China has a choice. They can try to invade Taiwan, or they can choose to fight a war that would be very difficult against the Philippines, which would drag in the U.S. They can't do both and win on both. So they have to choose one or the other. If they want to attack the Philippines, they've got to give up Taiwan, probably for some decades. If they want to attack Taiwan, they can't focus on the Philippines. This is just not a war that the Chinese want to fight. So it's an interesting point of view, I think something that, again, from my standpoint, is it just is not a good area for China to try to threaten the Philippines, but they're also probably in a position, the Chinese are in a position where they cannot give in or they'll lose face. So what Marcos is doing is trying to improve the country's ability to claim the sovereignty and its sovereign rights in the South China Sea, which is the area that's being referred to as the West Philippine Sea. I think that's there's several reasons that they've started using that name, and some of it is to help China have an out. So we'll see. So the strategic options for the Philippines and President Marcos is to create external partnerships, which he's doing. You see policies, obviously, he's leveraging the Strategic Defense Treaty with the United States. He's also getting closer ties with Japan, Australia. He's had exercises with France, Vietnam. So he's creating these external partnerships, which is something that China is absolutely opposed to. He's also trying to do policy changes to secure its lawfully internationally recognized waters in the West Philippine Sea. So the concerns about his policies can be sustained due to two reasons. If it can be sustained is the 2028 Philippine election, and right now the expected ascendancy of Sara Duterte, excuse me if I mispronounced that, and also the 2024 election of Trump. This one, again, is a tired argument that comes up, that they think that somehow Trump gets elected, all partnerships end. It's a little tiresome. It's a little amateurish by magazines and newspaper articles and reports. Yes, the dynamic will change. President Biden is very much of the point of view as building those alliances in the Pacific and Indo-Pacific and the South China Sea. That does not all come to an end. It all doesn't come apart just because President Trump is elected, if he gets elected in 2024. AUKUS was still around. The 3 pillars, 4 pillars was around. So there were still these alliances that were not changed just because President Trump was there. They're going to exist as well. The defense treaty with the Philippines didn't go away. The defense treaty with Japan didn't go away. So I think that people that write this need to be a little bit more, they need to stop taking the easy way out and stop being lazy in what they're writing. Yes, there is going to be a change in policy. Obviously, President Trump, if he gets elected, he does have differing positions than Biden, but the whole world doesn't come undone just because he was president. Because he was a president before and nothing really changed. So again, we always see that come up. It's a tired, lazy argument. I think if they could spend some time going into, it's easier just to say some blurb out there than going in there and working out that, yes, things are changing. How would they change? It's just people don't want to do the work for it. So it's funny. I read all these articles and it's always coming up. So it's lazy. Writers out there, try harder, come up with something better. So the other issue is that, okay, China exploits inconsistency in the Philippine approach to the South China Sea. So this is we'll talk about this later, is like these gentlemen's agreements that China keeps bringing up. These are things that they say that the China are overblowing. Is something that the previous president agreed to and is trying to hold the Philippines responsible for it, and just trying to make the Philippines look like they are the ones that are the unreasonable ones. They don't keep their word. So they're trying. The President Marcos is trying to create a unified approach that could carry past through his administration to make it easier or provide consistency in Philippine policy. Of course, that's up to the future elected leaders of the country that make a decision. But I think what he's trying to do is make sure that there's a streamlined policy of the Philippines that China understands and will hopefully recognize, and not try to wait till 2028 to see if there will be a change in leadership that China can try to leverage against the Philippines. But again, ultimately, it's up to the Philippines to make that decision. That's their country and how they want to elect their leaders. But I kind of understand what he's trying to do. Is he's getting often accused by China of these arbitrary nature of things that the previous president, China says. I won't sit there and say that the previous president agreed to. China says the previous president agreed to, but there's nothing in writing. So it does it does a big grain of salt that they're trying to create this divide between former President Duarte and President Marcos. So I have a lot of skepticism of China's motivation when they bring stuff like that up, of the previous presidency, and try to lock the current president into those commitments in something that was never signed. And China cannot provide anything that it was signed. So President Marcos is committed to upholding the 2016 decision that invalidated China's sweeping claims in the South China Sea. He has also been very hardline and says he is pledged not to abandon a square inch of Philippine territory to a foreign power. What he means is the exclusive, in the context of this, is of course all Philippine territory, but he also includes the exclusive economic zone of what he also calls, or what the Philippines now call the West Philippine Sea. So he's taking two approaches to this. He's trying to frame the West Philippine Sea in a people-centric lens so that he can keep public support for claiming its sovereignty against the expansionistic and hostile China. And he wants to signal to the world, too. He wants to signal the world that Philippines is intent to contribute to a rules-based model to keep the South China Sea open and to broaden partnerships with traditional, non-traditional partners who share similar goals of a rules-based system. To have that rule-based system, he has to have some defense-centric strategy. So he has to be able to provide the increase in armed forces to be able to provide where the Philippines is also playing a role, having a stake in maintaining that rule-based order and not just requiring or asking other countries to do that for them. So he's really putting the Philippines in a leadership role, or one to sit there and try to bring the resources to the region to show that this is important for other countries and that Philippines is willing to contribute to providing a rules-based order. So difficulty has been creating a strategy that has continuity over the administration so that China cannot attack those inconsistencies. So the idea is that he has to provide, so a lot of it's just trying to change some of the thinking of how the problems are approached. So transparency is key to this. So he welcomes, as we said, and you've seen this, is that he welcomes foreign and national coverage to cover the region in the West Philippine Sea to show China's atrocities, bullying, and how it impacts the Philippine people who get bullied by these China's tactics, and how China's policies threaten the food and energy security of the Philippines. So he creates efforts to allow Philippine fishermen to voice their concerns and provide them the resources on how they can exercise their rights in the West Philippine Sea. He's allowing civil rights, civil society groups, NGOs, basically non-governmental organizations, participate in the whole nation strategy of what he calls the whole nation strategy 2023 through 2028 national security policy. And he talks about the people's welfare in the West Philippine Sea is an important objective of his administration. So what he's intending to do is he's going in two sides of this. Is he's attempting to improve ties with China. He's met with President Xi in Beijing to improve ties and to manage tensions when he visited in January 2023. But China has shown no signs of de-escalating and continues to use the Chinese Coast Guard and the maritime militia to engage in provocative and illicit acts. So we'll come back to what he was talking about, like when he's talking about the bringing people into this, making it a people-centric. He was basically at this point, trying to show what the Chinese policies are doing to the Philippine people, helping them internalize what this issue is. So after visiting in 2023 and having no Marcos visit to China in 2023, and it's having no impact or showing that China has no intention to de-escalate the issue, the Philippines have adopted two approaches. One's called external balancing by deepening and broadening security cooperation with the U.S. and other traditional and non-traditional partners. So this is increasing U.S. rotational bases under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. This is not increasing the number of bases available for the U.S. to use. It's just increasing the amount of rotations of U.S. troops within those same number of bases. Reciprocal access agreements with Japan. Japan has access to certain Philippine bases, and the Philippines have access to certain Japanese bases. Deeper integration with the U.S., Philippines, and Japan trilateral and the Australia Quad. So the idea is to become more integrated, operating with U.S., Japanese, and Australian forces. And you've indeed seen exercises pick up throughout the winter and the spring of 2024, as you're starting to see more exercises conducted by the Philippines, including the last 2 years, the biggest Balikatan exercises with the U.S. this year, with the U.S. and France involved. So you're seeing working on trying to get integration with the U.S. With the Allied Armed Forces of Philippines, Japan. The U.S., Philippines, Japan, and Australia all working closely together. He set up a subcommittee on maritime security with the EU. So remember that a large point, I think 30% of all international trade goes through the South China Sea. What goes on in the South China Sea is important to Europe because trade is impacted through there. Set up a security memorandum of understanding with like-minded partners of India, the United Kingdom, France. France was involved in Balikatan 2024 exercise. Canada, Sweden, and the Netherlands. So he's looking, and these are the ones that are very much pushed the rules-based order, freedom of navigation, freedom of the seas. These are those traditional powers that believe in the use of international trade. Also, to establish the West Philippine Sea as an important link, allowing free and open access of the Indo-Pacific. So again, if China closes off the South China Sea, this will stop trade within the Indo-Pacific as well, as, again, 30% of trade flows through there. It's also not trade that goes through to China or from China to outward. It also goes for trade coming through from the Middle East, mainly oil and energy, coming up through the Middle East and coming to the countries in and around the South China Sea. So keeping open access to the South China Sea and the West Philippine Seas will allow open access to the Indo-Pacific region and allow international trade to continue without the permission of the Chinese, which is also, again, has been deemed illegal by the international courts of the laws of the sea. So the risk to the Philippines of this strategy is that 20% of its imports come from China and 90% of the Philippines' nickel trade goes to China. So if China decides to use its economic power, it could actually hurt the Philippine nickel trade and risk 20% of its imports that come from China. So if China decided that they wanted to put the economic hurt on the Philippines, this is a leverage that China has threatened against smaller countries in the region. It could do that, but it has chosen not to. There's a lot of headwinds in the Chinese economy, and they probably preferred not to cut off the nickel trade coming from the Philippines, or hurt themselves even more by cutting their imports from the Philippines or from China to the Philippines when they're already struggling with declining imports and declining factories or the output of factories because of foreign demand, foreign orders have been decreasing. So Philippines is in what's called the Phase 3 of modernization program. And again, this is part of the idea of creating a defense-centric view. They are in the process of acquiring modern weapons and equipment with the focus on the maritime domain. So they're spending less money on their army and more money on their naval assets, which also includes aircraft. So the Philippines are going in there and making this point to China is they are not interested in bloc politics. They don't want to interfere with Taiwan affairs. So this is things trying to signal to China that, hey, they just want freedom of navigation. They want the West Philippine Sea to be international or to be recognized by China and to stop the harassment. So the Philippines made the point that they're not interested in interfering in Taiwan affairs. That's a hot button issue for the Chinese. And the Philippines are saying, we're not interested in what goes on in that area. They basically a neutral point of view. Limit the number of bases available to the U.S. So they're allowing the rotations to increase, but they're not increasing the number of bases available to the U.S. They also said they will not do reprisals against the Chinese Coast Guard and Maritime Militia, which is used as lasers and water cannons against Philippine fishermen and also some government ships. Philippines says they will not reciprocate in kind, and they are interested in peaceful negotiations to resolve the dispute. So one thing I wrote in this here is about the people aspect of it. Is he wants that the Philippine citizens understand what China is doing to them. They showcase it. They have it well documented. The Philippines are taking the high road by not getting into the mud and doing reciprocal action against the Chinese. But he wants that Philippine voters understand and Philippine citizens understand what China is doing to their country. And this isn't about talking about policy debates. It's not talking about the details of some 2016 arbitrary agreement, which is important, but it doesn't. The average person doesn't think about it in those terms, like a government or would think about it. This is how do people view what China is doing to the Philippine people? What is it doing to their livelihood? Impacting fishing rights. Denying energy access within its own economic zone. So he's trying to internalize this to the Philippine people to understand and demonstrate this is what China is doing to their nation. So that's I think it's actually an important point of view. And that's the idea is that even as new administrations come in and the new administrations have policy, is what China is doing to the Philippine people becomes an important view of how they look at their leaders and what they expect from their leaders. And Philippines being a democracy is, if it's important to the Philippine people, it will be important to any future administration as well. So also this week, or over the last 2 weeks, China declares a 4-month fishing moratorium in the South China Sea that runs until September 16th, 2024. Now, China has done this since 1999. Illegally. The Philippine Department of Foreign Affairs responded back that China needs to cease and desist from conduct of illegal actions that violates Philippine sovereignty. The Philippines cited the final and binding 2016 award from the UN Courts for Maritime Law. So they're going and they says, well, we don't believe in this. We don't, you don't have China. You don't have the ability to close off the South China Sea, which includes the West Philippine Sea. So you don't. So they're telling you don't have the right to do this. Now, President Marcos has said that he's not necessarily opposed to fishing ban because the idea is the fishing ban is supposed to. China says it's to preserve the fishery and to prevent overfishing, which is true. That's a legitimate way to. Many countries do that, where they oppose or they put bans or seasons that not to allow overfishing and allow the recovery of fishery populations. So that's a normal policy. But the Philippines are arguing it's like they're not opposed to it, but it's not China's decision to make. The West Philippine Sea is the resources within the West Philippine Sea is under the jurisdiction of the Philippine government, not the Chinese government. So China states the Philippines' claim of sovereignty, which again, that also was backed up by an international court, is illegal, and the Global Times resorts to name calling. Wow. The Global Times, as an offshoot, I was around during obviously I was an adult during the Cold War, and I've read English versions of Izvestia and, what was it, Izvestia and, what was the other one? Wasn't TASS. Well, anyway, the Chinese, the Soviet Union's communist newspapers, and Pravda, that was the other one. Pravda and Izvestia. Wow. The Global Times, I think they take it a level above the ridiculousness of what the Soviet Union newspapers do, the resorting to name calling. It's almost like you enjoy reading this just for the laugh of that. This is an official mouthpiece of the Chinese government. You would like to think that maybe something was lost in the translation from Chinese to English. But anyway, it's infuriating in one way to read it, but also the way it's written, it is hilariously ridiculous that this is what the Chinese position has resorted to name calling. It is actually pretty funny and pretty pathetic that this is what the Chinese government has resorted to. So now the interesting thing is tying in is that when we start talking about the fishing moratorium, is typically the Philippines and the Vietnamese tend to ignore these moratoriums by the Chinese, because China's been doing it since 1999. They've largely ignored it, and then they continue about doing their business as their governments allow. Now, they do face increased harassment from the Chinese maritime militia and Coast Guard. So they do so at their own peril. Now, after the Atenito incident in the Scarborough Shoal, where Atenito was able to penetrate a blockade-like enforcement to keep the Philippines away from the shoal, they were able to get there before the Chinese could fully form up their blockade to the island, to the main Atenito force. So after this incident, which happened on around middle of May, the Chinese government announced on May 15th that they will start arresting trespassers. Now, trespassers is anybody that operates within the South China Sea without China's permission. The Chinese government will start arresting trespassers starting on June 15th. So, and why this is important is there's also a fishing ban. This is outside, okay, you've got the issues with the Scarborough Shoal, the Second Thomas Shoal, the Escoda Shoal, I think the Banks Reef, I think is what it's called, is you've got activities going on there that are already hot points for water cannoning from the Chinese Coast Guard and other illegal activities of the maritime militia. You have those activities. So outside of those, okay, and they're threatening to arrest those people. Now you've got this fishing ban coming. This fishing ban is being issued at the same time, what's called ban or moratorium, is coming at the same time that China is announcing that they will start arresting foreigners in the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea, starting on June 15th. So moratorium on fishing that Vietnamese and Philippine fishermen tend to ignore at the threat of more harassment from the maritime militia and Chinese Coast Guard, but they typically ignore it. Now they're facing the threat of arrest. So not only what's going on in the disputed shoals and reefs, now you've got Chinese or Philippine fishermen being threatened by the Chinese of arrest. how does this go? So the question is will China try to actually enforce this? They certainly can't give up on it. They've stated it. So if they don't enforce it, they're going to lose face. On the other side of it, President Marcos has said on May 29th, stated that the Chinese threat to arrest fishermen based on this reapplication of this law to arrest people. Now, the law is to arrest any quote unquote, quote, end quote, trespasser for 60 days in China without trial. That President Marcos stated that the Chinese threat to arrest fishermen based on the reapplication of the law will not be allowed. The Philippine Navy has talked about that they would protect Philippine citizens from this Chinese arrest threats. So, so the states that they will use. How are they going to stop this? The Philippines said they will use any way necessary to stop these aggressive actions by the Chinese, the threatening of arrests. And then you've got the Chinese who say they're going to arrest people. So who gives in on this? Interesting question, because, again, the Philippine Navy said they won't tolerate this. President Marcos says he won't tolerate it. The Chinese have said they will do this. They will arrest people, knowing that they risk an international incident. What happens if somebody gets killed? So it's a dangerous uptick in combat. So I suspect that you'll see more harassment from the Chinese, but you will not actually see arrest attempts, or you will see each other, both sides, stating their position, but will actually work to avoid each other so that neither side has to risk a confrontation on the sea. So more to come. See here, today is June 1st, so we'll see in 2 weeks to see how this starts going. But both are heading towards a disagreement. There was I wrote today about the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore this week, and President Marcos was the keynote speaker, and he spoke passionately about the challenges that Philippines are dealing with, the threats from China. So we will see more to come from that. So I will write again next week. So again, if you have any comments or you have anything, suggestions for me to read about the position within the Philippines, things that I'm missing, please feel free to put it in the comments sections, both on YouTube, Rumble, and on Substack. So that is the papers for this week. So I appreciate everybody's taking time to listen in. I ask that if you're interested in my content and you like what I'm writing, is you consider becoming a paid subscriber to Substack, or you can become an unpaid subscriber and receive all my updates in the email. You can become a follower on Substack as well. That's unpaid. You will not get the emails, but you'll have all my content. You'll be able to see my content, and you'll receive a notification on Substack when something's posted. Again, I'm also on Rumble under Pegasus Research. I'm also on YouTube under Pegasus Research. So you can also reach me on those for comment sections. Again, please consider becoming a subscriber, paid or unpaid, a follower on Rumble or YouTube, or also become a member. You can support me on Patreon. So any support would be greatly appreciated. So thank you for all the, there wasn't that many comments this week, not like we had comments last week, so there wasn't really any comments this week. Some thumbs up, so I appreciate that. So until next week, all of you have a great week. Look forward to seeing what happens out of the Shangri-La agreement this week and with the NATO agreements discussions about use of nuclear weapons. So we'll definitely see some updates on that this week. So until next week, all of you have a great week, and hope to hear from you, and we will talk again next week. Have a good week. Thank you.